Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for joining us at the Free Market Foundation media briefing. My name is Jane Boccaleone, and I manage media relations for the Free Market Foundation. Today we're going to talk about radical economic transformation, which is a very, very serious and important topic in South Africa today. The ANC and the government have hijacked it. It is their dominant and prevailing mantra, radical economic transformation. But what does it mean? What does it really mean, and how can we really achieve it in South Africa? The Free Market Foundation, since it started in some 40 years ago, has been talking about radical economic transformation and how to really achieve it. We've been talking about moving away, deviating from mainstream economic orthodoxy for a long time. So today, let me introduce Louw, who is the Executive Director of the Free Market Foundation and a founder member. He was around those 40 years ago. He's going to talk about radical economic transformation and tell us how to achieve it. Thank you.
Yes, the relatively small audience for our events is itself instructive, I think, in that it indicates the degree to which people wonder whether it is a real thing, whether it's electioneering political rhetoric, or whether it is going to happen in some or other form, and if it does, what form it will take. The Minister of Finance has himself said he doesn't know what it means, and it will in due course have to be defined. So we are going to suggest what it might mean, and particularly what it might not mean. And I am going to try to persuade everybody that it's necessary, that President Zuma is right. We need radical economic transformation, and that the last budget speech, which repeated the term 50 times in the budget speech, is also right. It is necessary and it should happen. And also about 50 times, the same number of times, it repeated the term inclusive growth. So we're going to talk about what radical economic transformation with inclusive growth means and how it can be achieved, and I'm going to try to make a case for it to be necessary, and in this sense I'm certainly with President Zuma, the former Minister of Finance and the present Minister of Finance, and others who have used the term. So it's not a case of hijacking the term, it's a case of it's long overdue. And we do need radical economic transformation. And what would be radical, what would be economic, what would be transformative, what would generate growth, and how would that growth be inclusive? So that's the agenda for today. So we're going to start off with some historical transformations briefly to put our situation in South Africa in context. We have had a few historically. We have the earliest people in South Africa. We were actually the transformation to human beings at the cradle of mankind. There is, at some anthropological level, uncertainty about whether it really was here, but basically every human being comes from Krugersdorp, and so I'm of the view that we do not want to encourage everyone to return to their country of origin, because we would have the entire world's population in Krugersdorp. That would be a very bad idea. But in a very real sense, every human being on earth is an African, and every human being on earth, in fact, is a South African, and every human being on earth comes from Krugersdorp, or Sterkfontein to be precise. The only truly indigenous South Africans in the modern use of the term indigenous are, of course, the Khoisan. Everyone else migrated to South Africa from the 1500s on. We had from the north people migrating into South Africa, the Nguni being the biggest and most significant group, and from the south, the Europeans and subsequently other groups, and from, actually, I suppose, from the east, India into KZN and Durban, or as it was then known. So yes, we've had these big transformations. Colonialism was Dutch, then British, ended in 1904. Then we had apartheid from essentially 1652. People think apartheid started with the National Party. I've never been quite sure why that is the view. That's when it got a name. But essentially from 1652 on, there have been racially discriminatory laws in South Africa. They varied from extreme to moderate, but nonetheless there has always been in some or other form apartheid since 1652. And before that there were various versions of apartheid that were applied amongst people of a similar skin color or complexion. It doesn't stop it having been discriminatory and oppressive and colonial, but nonetheless the racially conspicuous form of colonialism started in 1652 and apartheid in its modern form. Our history and the recording of our history has been bedeviled all along by race. The rest of our history that is not racial tends not to be taught, tends to be forgotten, tends to be trivialized, tends to be overlooked, and I'm not going to go into that now, but it is nonetheless important, and I think the obsession with race throughout our history, including now, comes at some expense to us, and I'm going to try to deal with how to overcome that problem. Apartheid experienced its boom years. This was one big transition from the 60s to the mid-70s, when there was high economic growth. South Africa was one of the most prosperous economies in the world. Needless to say, it was racially divided, and the people who were advancing most rapidly and spectacularly were white, and to a lesser extent coloured and Asian, or maybe even to a greater extent Asian. The Asian population or Indian population at one point, or for quite a long while, had a higher per capita income than white Afrikaners. Interesting, the perpetrators, the oppressors, didn't benefit themselves nearly as much as people imagine. The Jews and Anglo-Saxon English and Asians outperformed them, and in fact white Afrikaners were throughout the apartheid era virtually the poorest white people on earth. If two Dutch brothers had been in Holland and one had emigrated to South Africa, the other stayed in Holland, those who stayed in Holland would have had a higher per capita income, higher living standards, and been better off, had more freedom and so on, so that the idea that the perpetrators of apartheid benefited from it is not nearly as clear-cut as people imagine. The Dutch without apartheid did better off than the Dutch with apartheid. That's really what that tells us. Nonetheless, there were these boom years where South Africa was one of the best performing economies in the world, and then we went into the apartheid bust years, when there was essentially stagnation for a generation. For one generation, the average South African, in international currency terms, dollar terms, had the same or a lower per capita income than when they were born. So there was stagnation for essentially the last generation of the last century. And then we went into the era of mineral wealth, and what we had was wealth in South Africa from minerals people assumed, spectacular mineral wealth. According to various definitions of it, we probably had the world's highest endowment of mineral wealth anywhere. And now we have the resource curse. We have actually assumed that our mineral wealth can be good for us, and so the government has nationalized mineral rights, and all that's happened is our mineral prosperity has collapsed, investment in mining has crashed, and we are no longer the world's leading producer of minerals, of a wide range of very valuable minerals. But nonetheless, our mineral wealth was an important positive factor, and now it seems, if anything, has become an important negative factor. The resource curse to economists is the phenomenon that resource-rich countries in the world often underperform. Nigeria, Russia, South Africa, various countries, Zambia, so on, Zimbabwe, and resource-poor countries overperform. They are the so-called economic miracles, the success stories, the resourceless countries, Switzerland, Singapore, Hong Kong, Mauritius, Rwanda, and so on around the world. The resource-rich countries tend to underperform, and the resource-poor countries tend to overperform, but of course it's not that simple and clear-cut. There are exceptions in both directions. So then if we move on to why do we need radical economic transformation, and this is the part that I think is easily overlooked in South Africa and is buried in the rhetoric, the loose-tongue rhetoric about radical economic transformation doesn't actually pause to say, why is it needed? And let's go into that. We have at the moment radical economic stagnation and in many senses actual regression. I experienced some of the regression this weekend when I went through a puddle of water in the main road, the main central intersection of Morgenson in Mpumalanga, or is it there? I can't remember which province it's in. Anyway, Morgenson. And what happened is that there was a pothole under this water so deep that I crashed against the other side of it and smashed my radiator, and my car broke down in the rain and the sleet and the wet and the mud, and is now being repaired in Bethel after having been towed there. So that was a sign of regression. Radical economic regression is the disappearance of roads that have been there for a very long time. The other kind of roads, by the way. And then radical junk status. The junk status in South Africa is more radical, and there's a lot of loose, again, uninformed, silly rhetoric about what does it matter, who cares what the rating agencies say. The fact is that every single individual is personally, directly, and severely impacted by it. It means that you will pay more interest. You will have less access to capital. That the economy will stagnate and there will be more unemployment. There will be less investment. Everything will cost more. So the impact on ordinary civilians of being downgraded to junk status is forgotten. This isn't some lofty, abstract development that takes place in the ether somewhere. This is something that impacts ordinary people in their daily lives very severely. So this is extremely radical to be downgraded, and it's very difficult to be upgraded again. It takes a long time. Very few countries achieve it within a year or more. And that's when they really pull out the stops and they radically transform. If you do radical transformation, you will be lucky to be out of the junk status hold in as little as 2 or 3 years. So then there is radical, mainly black, what I call the terrible triplets. And these are very radical. They're always lumped together, although they shouldn't go together. And this is what they are. There's unemployment, poverty, and inequality. These are spoken of as if they're 3 facets of the same triangle, as if they're part of the same thing. They basically have very little to do with each other. In fact, something that might solve the inequality problem might have to increase the poverty problem. It's very easy, actually. You just make everyone poorer, then you have more equality. If you make people richer, if you have high growth, and some people rise from the lower levels, you have increasing inequality. So alleviating poverty might come by increasing inequality. And that's not a racial statement. That is just a simple economic statement. To give you a simple example, what happened in China and India is billions of human beings, essentially all destitute and poor. They experience the world's highest growth rates for large countries. And what happens is 1 billion out of 6 billion rise like a genie spectacularly. And then people say China and India are grappling with the problem of inequality. No, inequality is the solution. It's the solution to their former poverty. It's that lots and lots of people are rising, and the question is really how do you get those who've been left behind to rise with them or rise as well? But the idea that there are 3 facets of one thing and you deal with all 3 simultaneously is quite mistaken. And then unemployment is another one. If you regard the wealth of those who have jobs as a measure of the absence of poverty, well, then increasing unemployment is a way to increase wealth. And I'm not sure why we're having this feedback here, but hopefully it'll be addressed. So what you do is, if you increase unemployment and you don't measure the income of the unemployed, you appear to have increased wealth, which is the illusion of the minimum wage. You raise the minimum wage and you say, there you are, people are earning more. Well, no, what's happened is more people are earning nothing. As the economist Thomas Sowell says, the minimum wage is always exactly the same. All minimum wages everywhere are precisely the same, namely 0. What a minimum wage does is it condemns large numbers of people to 0 wage, and that is what it does. So that increases poverty if you include in your measure of poverty those people who are thrown into destitution and unemployment. Then we have radical pessimism. There's an enormous amount of pessimism in South Africa. I don't share it. I'm actually strangely bullish and optimistic about South Africa, and I think I find myself often the odd one out, and I think there are very good reasons to be optimistic, one of which is the talk of radical economic transformation, and the other, as I will explain, is the crisis within the ruling alliance, which is a very positive and long overdue development, regardless of which side you are on, whether you support it or not. Then there's radical capital and skills flight. Yesterday it was announced that they want to introduce measures to stop immigration. Well, why would you want to do that? In a successful country, you have measures to stop immigration, like Donald Trump. You know, they want to keep people out. And if we want to keep people in, that is your way of saying we are a failure. We are a radical disaster, and people are leaving the sinking ship. So announcing a measure to stop people immigrating and having a thing like foreign exchange control to stop people taking their money out is an admission of radical failure. And it's very radical. It's very, very serious. Can you imagine trying to keep people in like a prison? That is a very serious statement. If Donald Trump were saying we're building a wall to stop Americans fleeing to Mexico, that would be much more serious than him saying we stop building a wall to stop Americans fleeing to America. Are we going to try and get this? Is that it? Yeah, probably that's it. So that's a radical issue, and again I want to stress, don't just let this news pass you by. Pause and say, what is really being told to us here? What are really the implications of something like this? How radical and serious is this? You know, do you really want to live in a country where the government has to keep the people in, as opposed to a country where the government wants to keep people out? And that's a very radical and very serious statement, and something that needs to be fixed to become a country that attracts people rather than repels people, which is what the government believes we are now, hence proposing policies to stop the people who are repelled from being repelled. And then the radical ruling party crisis. I want to address this very briefly, but it's a bigger topic. Our former state president, Kgalema Motlanthe, said the alliance no longer exists. Now, he's right. It doesn't exist. It has absolutely crashed and collapsed, and there's a crisis as they try to hold it desperately together. When I sat next to Aziz Pahad, former minister, cabinet minister, various posts, I think the one he held longest or most was foreign affairs, and he was lamenting the state of affairs in South Africa and the alliance. I said to him, the trouble with you, the stalwarts, the elders of the party who returned to South Africa, was that you kept the alliance going after 1994. It had served its purpose against a common enemy. There was no logic in keeping it together afterwards. The ANC should have become a political party, COSATU a trade union movement, and the SACP, whatever, go off and do its own thing. And perpetuating it since 1994 was a mistake. His words to me were 1994 was too late. When it was unbanned, it should have been said, well, the purpose of the alliance is now served, it has been successful, it's been triumphant, let's now part ways and move on in our own directions. What it has been bad for the ANC, the once mighty dominant political party that didn't need the alliance but held on to it because it meant a few extra votes. It was a bit of political greed that kept it going, but it was inevitably going to be its own undermining. COSATU has been a victim of the alliance too. It has been schizophrenic. It hasn't been able to decide, is it part of government, is it part of civil society, is it the government or the trade union movement, what is it exactly? And the ANC has had the same dilemma. The only victor of the alliance, by a very, very, very big margin, is the SACP. It has laughed all the way to the cabinet. It has over half of all senior positions, half of all cabinet positions, depending on, nobody really knows because it's a secretive organization who is and isn't a member. And it's interesting that that has never been challenged, never has always just been accepted. The secretive organization can basically cannibalize the two supposedly big giant alliance partners and really take over control of this alliance. And the two big giants, the elephants in the room, have been undermined and whittled away and are now shadows of their former self, to the point where the former president Motlanthe says it actually no longer in any real sense exists. And that is quite serious. It's quite serious even whether the ANC exists. Under Mandela and Mbeki, if one spoke about the ANC, you meant a member of an alliance. And if you spoke about the alliance, you spoke about the alliance. That's disappeared. Now people say the ANC, but nobody really knows what does that mean. Does that mean the alliance, or does it mean a party, a member of the alliance? The ANC never has a meeting, which is just ANC. All meetings, every meeting President Zuma ever has, every meeting in Luthuli House is a meeting of the alliance. It includes members of COSATU and the SACP. So there is no longer a distinctive thing called the ANC. Now that's very, very serious, very radical. And the ANC has a choice now whether to regroup and to reassert itself as a distinctive party, or whether to basically remain submerged and undermined and essentially eroded by trying to stay within this thing called the alliance or the ANC. Nobody really knows anymore. The distinction has vanished. And that's quite serious and quite radical. And then there's radical hysteria. There's a lot of this hysterical racism going on. Some silly woman with a Facebook page that has 3.5 friends says something about monkeys, and the whole nation is in a state. We all know her name. Why do we care about who this stupid, silly person is? And it tells us more about us than about her. It tells us more about everyone other than the woman concerned. And then you get an eminent, prominent economist, Chris Hart, sends out a somewhat ambiguous tweet, and again the nation is in apoplexy, and his life and his career are destroyed. This is a very, very serious, silly state of affairs. We will know we have dealt with a race problem when we can tell racial jokes again. And that is something, or you can tell you've overcome the Jewish problem when you can tell anti-Semitic jokes, or the feminist problem when you can tell gender jokes or whatever. So I have sort of joke standard. When you can joke about something, you know you've actually overcome the problem. When you can't joke about it and you get hysterical about some silly woman with no Facebook friends in Cape Town, in Durban, sorry, then that's quite serious. Then we have daily demonstrations and unrest in South Africa, more than one a day. Every day, somewhere, there is a demonstration, a riot, some form of unrest. The police are out, the riot squads are out, tear gas and rubber bullets are used daily. Now that's radical. That is serious. And it's now so commonplace it isn't even reported anymore. Only sometimes, like Kolini, where there's kind of widespread racial violence, does it get reported. But every single day somewhere in South Africa, often 2 or 3 times a day, bearing in mind the average is more than one a day, but many of them go on for a few days. So that every day there are probably 3 or 4 demonstrations, riots, unrest situations in the country. That is serious. That means that, for example, the developmental state has not developed. It's failed. It's a radical failure. And so that's serious. And then there are these crazy proposals and policies that come out every day. They announced, for example, that they're going to basically nationalize the whole network infrastructure for cell phones and telecommunications into a kind of telecommunications Eskom, sort of one state-run monopoly controlling all, taking over all the infrastructure, all the cables, all the towers, all the spectrum, in a way that no other country in the world has done, with one exception, Rwanda, where it's a disaster and it's a tiny little country smaller than a South African city. The entire population, and in fact even the area, is smaller than, say, the PWV area or the Kruger Park. So we have a silly, stupid, crazy proposal. You can't be more polite about it. It's just simply nuts. This ICT white paper approved by the Cabinet, with no proper socio-economic impact assessment, no understanding of how it would actually work. And when we announced that the paper says that there will be nationalization into a state-run monopoly of telecommunications infrastructure, the minister and the DG say, no, that's not what we mean. Well, what do they mean? Nobody knows. There's just some crazy, hysterical policies get announced to appear to be doing something. And this so-called WOAN, the Wireless Open Access Network, supposedly to give network access to poor South Africans and low-income South Africans. Whereas, in fact, telecommunications, cell phones, is one of the South Africa few great success stories. If there's anything we must not tamper with, bearing in mind it started essentially in 1994, so it's an entirely new South Africa industry phenomenon. We now have more active cell phones than the entire population, and that is because about 75 or 80% of people have a phone, and some have more than one. And so this is one of our huge accomplishments. Far from messing with it, the government should be boasting about it, should be saying, look what we've achieved in the new South Africa. And what we have instead is a decision to seize the entire system that is such a huge success and put it into a catastrophe like Eskom, an old apartheid dinosaur that nobody else in the world runs anymore. Nothing like Eskom exists in other countries. They've all moved on to energy markets, competing energy providers, and unbundling of, for example, the transmission and the production. So we have a radical perpetuation of apartheid dinosaurs in all these state-owned enterprises. That's one of the first things to do, is to stop that, end it, get rid of it, that inheritance from the past, that legacy from the past. So then look at what radical economic transformation should not be. Not more of the same. What would be really radical? Now, how many in this room actually think that you are going to see radical things being done? Truly radical changes? Or do you expect to see the same stuff being done, either just continued or maybe in some slightly more geared up way, sort of dial up the volume a bit on what's failed? And the call for radical economic transformation is an admission that we have failed and that what we've got is failing. So just dialing up what we've got would certainly not be radical, it would not be transformative, and it would be more of the same. So that's certainly not radical and transformation. Then would we have radical economic perpetuation of what we've got? And that is certainly not going to help either. Same statement, really. Or radically intensifying what we've got. In other words, doing what fails in a more radical way. In other words, having a radical failure instead of a moderate failure. Is that what radical economic transformation means? Radical application of what fails. And then, in other words, more radical failure. Now, what has failed? Let's be very specific. The greater role for government. It was said there must be a greater role for government. We have a greater role for government. We have the biggest government in our history. We have one of the biggest governments as a proportion of GDP and economically active and employed population and capital formation in the world. We rank up there with countries that are considered socialist or communist or fascist. So we have that has failed. Greater role for government has failed. Are we going to have an even greater role? In other words, an even greater failure. Are we going to have failed economic developments, developmental state? I always think the emphasis is on mental rather than develop. So we've got a failed mental state. And, we have these daily demonstrations and so on. A failed fiscal and monetary policy. With the worst ever in our history. We have the highest rate of taxation as a proportion of GDP ever in our history. We have the biggest budget as a proportion of GDP, I believe, or one of the biggest in the world on education. And who would regard our education system as a great success? And we have a collapsing currency. We have a rand that is an embarrassment, a national embarrassment. So our monetary and fiscal policy is a radical failure. And I want to stress radical. It's not just a little bit of a failure. It's a radical failure. And then we have failed state-owned enterprises. We have endless turnaround strategies. They turn around so fast and they replace their CEOs so fast that everyone is too dizzy to actually get any work done. They're sort of like people who didn't learn how to pirouette in these companies, and they're stumbling all over the place, falling all over the place from all these turnaround strategies. Now, you're not going to get South African Airways to function. How many times must they try and fail? How many times has it been announced that this time we'll get it right? This time we're going to sort it out. This time it's not going to get any more future subsidies and bailouts. The answer is no. It is inherently a failure. It is profoundly a failure, and the only way to stop it is to stop the failure, not to perpetuate the failure, which is what is announced. And Eskom has duped surprisingly many people into believing that somehow it has overcome the energy crisis. No. The lack of supply of energy, we have less energy being produced now than we did 5 years ago. So the decline in energy production has led to people doing without energy. So people have bought generators, and people have gone off grid, and they've got solar panels. And every time you see a solar panel, please look at it as complete waste. That is money wasted. That money should have been in the form of cheap electricity. My wife and I have just built a house in a little dorp called Wakkerstroom. We're about 80% off grid. That's expensive. You have to have extra insulation. You have to have solar panels. You have to have burners. You have to have all forms of central heating and stuff, so-called energy-saving light bulbs. And they are, every time you hear of one or see one or buy one, think of it as an energy-inefficient light bulb. In other words, it costs a lot because you can't get electricity. So what has happened is everybody has started consuming less electricity, and then it appears as if the problem has been solved. No, it's been solved at the waste of many billions of rands. In fact, economist Davy Root estimates the cost to the South African economy to be something, I forget his exact number, but it's something like 400 billion rand annually. We are poorer every year. The GDP is 400 billion rand smaller. It's $1.5 trillion. 400 billion smaller, it would have been nearly, what's it, 3 trillion, 3.5 trillion. It would be 4 trillion or more if we had energy sufficiency at low cost. So it's a catastrophe on a scale that is unimaginable. Let me just give you a number there. People want land reform, which Minister Nkwinti said meant redistributing white commercial farms, or 30 or 40% of white commercial farms, to black South Africans. Well, let's say 100% get redistributed. How much would that be? Well, the answer is all farms put together are worth between 900 billion and $1 trillion. Let's say $1 trillion, nice round number, 1 trillion. 100 billion, 90 billion or 100 billion is the value of all white commercial farms. That is less than half of the cost overrun on one power station, Medupi. It's nothing. It's a fraud. It's a lie and a fraud to black South Africans to tell them that redistributing white commercial farms will have some value for black people. The answer is no. It's worth next to nothing. And the cost of Medupi alone, the overrun, not the cost, the overrun, the waste, inefficiency and incompetence, is more than double the value of all white commercial farms. That's how silly these proposals are. Really, just you cannot be charitable about them. It's people who just haven't thought it through, haven't done a napkin calculation on what they're talking about. Then there's failed labour policy. According to Dennis Dykes, economist of Nedbank, we have the world's highest sustained rate of unemployment. In other words, there are a few countries that occasionally dip to a higher level than us, but an ongoing sustained rate, we have the world's, he says, highest. I haven't myself checked the numbers. I heard him say that on a radio station, but if it's not the highest, it's maybe in the top 5 or whatever. So, now this is catastrophe. You know, we have 8.5 headed towards 9 with the minimum wage. They say a statistically insignificant number will be added. That means about another million. 1 million unemployed human beings are called insignificant, please note, in the introduction of a minimum wage. Destitute human beings, single mothers with children to feed, thrown out onto the streets and into the shanties and begging and selling their bodies. This is insignificant. This is what it's called in the minimum wage rhetoric. So what we will have is we have this catastrophe. Soon we will have more unemployed people than employed people. And this is, we're certainly about the same now. And how serious is that? How radical is that? And how desperate does that make us for transformation? Then we have a failed regulatory tsunami, laws being passed by the huge quantities of regulations, national credit, consumer protection, which really is just another way of saying denying consumers the right of access to cheap goods and services, national credit, which is another way of saying denying credit to people who are not considered so safe that you will never run the risk of having made a reckless loan or given reckless credit, which gets defined after you've given the credit, and so on. So we have this tsunami of laws and regulation and this burgeoning bureaucratic empires, like the Financial Services Board, one of my most loathsome of all of them, which used to be, a few people in an office somewhere managing and implementing the financial services laws, is now hundreds of people spending 4 billion rand annually, employing hundreds of advocates and lawyers, regulating the financial system, and they cannot tell Parliament one single benefit they've generated. When they were asked to report 2 years ago on what they'd achieved, they said they had deregistered 16,000 financial service providers. Now, what color do you think those people were who were moving into the financial services sector? What color do you think their clients and customers were? That was what they boasted to Parliament they'd achieved. They could not say they'd achieved a higher rate of return on savings and investment. They couldn't say they'd achieved cheaper and more available insurance. They couldn't say they'd achieved more banking facilities for people. They'd achieved the opposite. The failure rate of policies, the premature cancellation of policies went up under their watch. So that all they have done is thrown people out of work and denied low-income, entry-level people financial services. And yet they are now going to be turned into twin peaks, which is a way of saying two of them instead of one, as if one wasn't bad enough. You're now going to get it even worse. So it goes. Then there is the failed growth policies. How many have we had? Just every now and then there's a new version, a new policy. The latest trendy one is the NDP, which almost nobody has read, nobody really cares about. We're supposed to implement it. It's kind of seems sort of half pro-business, therefore sort of okay. It tries to be all things to all people, but we are not having growth. So we have to say, however much anyone might like the NDP, it has either failed or it hasn't been implemented, one of the two. Now, it may be both. But nonetheless, we have the policy and we don't have growth. So we don't have, so it is a failure, and we have economic stagnation. What is happening over here? Let's see if we can get this further down. Then we have failed broad-based black economic empowerment. Now, I put a question mark over there because I personally don't think this has failed. I'm one of the few people who thinks we do have broad-based black economic empowerment. But nonetheless, the official rhetoric is we have a slow pace of change, nothing has changed, whites still own everything, everything is owned by white monopoly capital, things are as bad as they were under apartheid, which is a very strange and racist statement. To say that when we have a black democratic government, and black people are liberated from the oppressive apartheid regime, the crime against humanity, that things have not improved for black people, is to say that black government is as bad for black people as Verwoerd was, as Vorster was, as Strydom was, as apartheid was. This is a very strange view, a very strange rhetoric, yet it's the prevailing narrative. Everyone says it, white and black, nothing has changed. Apartheid, which many people say, apartheid was even better for black people, which is a very bizarre statement to make. Are they really saying that black people are so bad at governing that well, it's completely crazy. I think actually there has been a substantial broad-based black economic empowerment, but nonetheless that's the rhetoric of failure. So what would actual radical transformation be? Radical economic transformation? This is what I suggest. This is what you can actually do. Firstly, it has to be radical. Not a tweaking of what we've got, not a change of what we've got, not dialing up what we've got, but radically changing what we've got, to be really radical. So I'm going to go into what amounts to. It's got to be economic. Now, economic does have consequences. It means at the expense of other virtues, for example, human rights or the rule of law or whatever. So if you want something to be economic, you often imply that it is at the expense of what's not economic. Now, that's a whole lot of other human virtues, social progress, equality, civil liberties, whatever it might be. So that might be what's implied. Now, well, to give you a simple example, if you nationalize the spectrum and you nationalize the internet telecommunications system, you would do so at the expense of property rights, for example. So economic progress might mean that. And then transformative. It must really transform and not just be the same, more of the same. And is it purely racial? Does the term refer only to racial transformation? Now, it might. I'm quite happy if it does. And we can talk about how to make it racial. But I hope people want something more than just racial transformation, just a change of who owns shares on the stock exchange, for example. That is of very little meaning to ordinary people. So what would inclusive growth, bearing in mind it is always put together. In fact, the new minister, Gigaba, says that it is really about inclusive growth. Whatever it is, it means inclusive growth. So he's tried to shift the emphasis from radical economic transformation to inclusive growth. In a strange way, that's a pity. Many people take relief and comfort from it and think it's going to comfort foreign investors, but I would like him to actually say, no, we really do need to have radical economic transformation. And what is inclusive? Is this just rhetoric? Or do they really mean inclusive? Do they mean rural peasants? Do they mean people in shanty towns? Do they mean small and independent businesses? Do they mean informal traders who are now being driven off the streets by police dogs and the red ants and horses and batons and gas and rubber bullets? Do they mean including people who are now excluded out of the mainstream? That is then the question. And does growth mean really achieving growth? Now, you don't need an NDP. You don't need a committee. You don't need any. How to achieve growth is not rocket science. It's straightforward. It's very, very simple. You just look around the world at the countries with growth and you say, what do they do? And what they do is privatize and liberalize and balance the budget and cut taxes and cut spending and leave things to the market. That is what causes growth. There are no exceptions. No countries like Venezuela or Cuba or anywhere that increases the role of government have growth. You don't get growth that way. So what they must do is say, let's do what gets growth. And that's easy, straightforward, simple. You increase your score on the various international indices that coincide with growth. Then the centrality of race is a big issue in South Africa. And we need to decide, what do we mean? Do we mean by black advancement, that should be triple B, BEE, or just BEE, meaning elites only? That's really how these terms have played out over time. BEE means a few hundred elites being turned into billionaires, and broad-based black economic empowerment means ordinary people, the rising middle class. Now, let's just think of that briefly. It's now estimated to be something like 6 million black people, more than the entire white population, up from less than 1 million in 1994, well below 1 million, probably something like 700,000, now up to 6 million people with credit cards and bank accounts and cell phones and motor cars and swimming pools and houses in the suburbs. That is is that what we mean? Broad-based advancement, or do we mean a few elites, which is what the rhetoric is about? How many directors are on listed companies? Is that really what it means? That would be of very little meaning at all. And then, would it be at white expense? There's a kind of idea that white people have enough wealth that if it's simply redistributed, black people will be wealthy. Simple arithmetic again tells you no. It's about 10 to 1. 10 to 1 black people to white people. So every 10 rand you take from a white person is 1 rand for a black person. That is not going to bring about any prosperity or advance. The people never spoken about are coloreds and Indians and Asians. This is very interesting. Where do they fit in? how do they fit into this equation? And they are increasingly now, coloured people in particular, busy complaining about being marginalised and omitted. And this is a potential time bomb which we haven't really dealt with in South Africa in the rhetoric. So, the post-apartheid economy has been characterised, the apartheid was characterised by white capitalism. Whites were free and capitalistic. Black socialism, blacks were, everything in black areas was run and owned by the state. That's the definition of socialism. And then post-apartheid had these three major phases. Firstly, Mandela, who ran non-racial free market policies, or under whom there were non-racial free market policies. Then Mbeki, under whom things were basically directionless, very little changed in any identifiable direction. And now under Zuma, where there's a kind of trend towards racial socialism. Those are the three post-apartheid, the major three post-apartheid phases. Then there's the post-apartheid myth, that there's rising inequality, slow pace of change, white monopoly capital, white domination, colonial legacy. This is not borne out by the statistics. Now, I don't expect you to believe me on this. What I want to suggest you do is go to the presidency's website and download a document called the 20-Year Review, which was produced largely by Stats SA, and has many or most of the statistics relating to the state of South Africa racially and in other ways. But for example, how many black people are literate compared to how many were previously literate? What is the life expectancy of South Africans by race and gender? What is the number of housing that South Africans have, the quantity of housing, and so on. The statistics are all there, and they're really quite impressive, and this rhetoric is simply not factually true. It is talk without data, without sources. The presidency's own website has all of the relevant data to show, and in fact I often wonder why the ANC is so bad at its own propaganda when it has actually achieved a great deal, or a lot has been achieved under its watch. Then the post-apartheid fact is therefore that there has been real and substantial transformation, and we have stopped having transformation. So the problem is, how do you get back to transforming racially? The global inequality propaganda is bad for us. We've been caught up in this nonsense spewed by Oxfam and Piketty about global inequality being high and growing, and I'm not going to spend time on it, but just give you one little statistic quickly. I pointed out that the 8 richest people Oxfam says own more wealth than the world's poorest 50%. I pointed out that what they own together, according to Oxfam, which is $440 billion, is peanuts compared to the amount of wealth in the world, the global GDP, for example, or the global capital formation, or the capital formation and wealth and income in the hands of the poorest 50%. It's nothing. And our economist Jason Urbach said to me, well, it might be peanuts, but did you actually work out what peanuts are worth? So I did. And the world's peanut production, now I'm not talking about macadamias and walnuts and all sorts of fancy nuts that the rich eat. I'm talking about the nuts that the poor eat, peanuts. Well, it turns out by sheer fortunate coincidence to be precisely the same number, 440 billion rand, as the world's 8 richest people own. And that's annual, bearing in mind they own it all the time. They don't get 440 billion every year. They have 440 billion full time. Every year, the poor eat as many peanuts as the rich 8 own. So it shows you just what nonsense Oxfam, or Oxscam as I call it, generates. South Africa's hooked up in that rhetoric. We fall for it, we believe it, we think it's true here too, which it isn't. And what is then South Africa's future? Now, the word crisis in Chinese, according to Kennedy, is a combination of 2 symbols meaning danger and opportunity. So do we have a crisis in South Africa? And the answer is, I would say, yes. Does that crisis generate an opportunity? And I would say yes. So that the idea, it's not really what the Chinese thing means, but it's nice. It's a nice sort of line to have. It worked for Kennedy, but it's not an accurate translation if there's anyone here who knows Chinese. But that aside, we have a danger, we have a crisis, and that brings about an opportunity for radical economic transformation. And what form would it take? Well, firstly, the ANC, is it in decline or is it due for a rebirth? Is it going to resurrect itself? Is it going to stand up, dust itself off, and reinstate the centrist moderate party it was for nearly 100 years? And that's the great question that it now faces. Will it continue to destroy itself by trying to out-left the left and trying to hold on to this failed alliance, according to one of its and many of its own leaders, Kgalema Motlanthe in particular, who's come out outspokenly on it? What will its future be? Now, I would like to see it being reborn. I think we need a centrist, moderate ANC back again. But if it goes, then other alliance partners might come into the gap and fill either the DA or some alliance of moderate parties, COPE and UDM and Inkatha and so IFP and so on. So either way, the question is, will we go back to some kind of centrist, moderate, sensible policies of the kind Mandela and Mbeki ran? And then how will we overcome the negative climate of opinion in South Africa? And for that, you do need radical transformation. You need something truly radical. You need the rule of law upheld. You need markets and property titling. I'm going to get to that in my closing comments. So the negatives in South Africa, very briefly, we have one of the biggest governments in the world. We have really bad government by all international indices. The Economic Freedom Index, the Rule of Law Index, International Property Rights, World Bank, World Economic Forum, Freedom House, rating agencies, and so on. On every published index, South Africa is tumbling down. It's very, very serious, very big crisis for us, very much disastrous. Black property rights. Interestingly, the reversal of property rights, the law now before Parliament that property can be expropriated without compensation. Do people realize that it's not just white people who this applies to? It means black people who were victims of racial apartheid land law that denied the right to black people to own land and gave the government the power to seize black-owned land, like not far from us here, Alex Township in 1968. Freehold title held by black people, seized under the group area laws. Are we truly going to go back to that? Are we truly going to reinstate the law that allows that? Would black people really put up with that? And the reason black people are not outraged by the proposal is because of the illusion that's been created is that the property rights being eroded are white people's property rights. No, it's everybody's property rights. So if you think the struggle against apartheid was to get property rights for black people, realize the government is now going straight back to what black people had under apartheid. Right back to it, fully fledged, undiluted. And that is what is now being proposed. Economic illiteracy, this idea of a developmental state and bigger government role for government. One of our big serious problems is how few people actually understand simple economics, why markets work, what markets are, what the price mechanism is, how it works. People think, for example, the Competition Commission is helping us from some or other problem. On the contrary, what the Competition Commission mostly does is stops people competing effectively by, for example, forming alliances and cooperation, which they call collusion. One way to compete, if you're a small business, is to form yourself into alliances and groups, as, for example, the egg producers did, and the Competition Commission said it's horizontal collusion and banned it, which destroyed hundreds of small poultry and egg producers. Again, guess what colour most of them were? And played right into the hands of the long-established poultry industry. And that's typically what happens because of this economic illiteracy. Racism. There's a kind of weird inequality ideology at the moment. It's quite strange how racist people can be. When we go and suggest to a largely black ANC local government that they should give all black people full freehold title on their land, or we go and suggest it to the DA, Helen Zille, when she was mayor of Cape Town, or we suggest it to the IFP or anyone else, we get told, but will they appreciate what land ownership means? Won't they sell the land and become homeless and indigent again? What do they mean, they? By they mean black people. They never say that about white people. Why is there this view that everyone holds, regardless of race or political affiliation, that black people can't be trusted to own land exactly the same way white people historically have held land and still do in the so-called townships, and millions of black people moving into the townships now own land, and they're ignored. They're as if they don't exist. Over half of all new land acquisitions are black buyers in what we call the suburbs, the historically predominantly white areas. So black people are perfectly capable of owning and trading and mortgaging and dealing with land the same way, simply the way human beings do. It's got nothing to do with race. Then there's this stifling over-regulation, which is mainly a barrier to people moving up, and in South Africa that has a racial component. Every regulation, I was recently asked to fill in a form to become a signatory on a bank account. I couldn't, this form is 4 pages long. It would have taken me 2 hours just to be a signatory. All the bank needed to know was who I am and that I'm authorized to sign. But there's this thing, I abandoned it. I gave it to one of my assistants and said, please see if you can work out what this means. And then when we ask the bank, they say, oh, it's because of FICA. Now, FICA should be bombed, for heaven's sake. It's not led to a single successful prosecution. It's a huge obstacle and a barrier to less sophisticated people. I'm a qualified lawyer. Advocate Ashina Singh runs this organization. She couldn't work out how to fill in a form to become an authorized signatory. Now you want small emerging businesses to run bank accounts and become registered companies and break through the informal sector glass ceiling? That is what we're facing in South Africa. There are many positives. We are a mature democracy, and I think this is a result of the crisis that's happened in the ruling alliance, is that for the first time you can look around you. In the past, you always knew how people would vote by looking at their race. You no longer know that. You can now look around this room and you have no idea how people are going to vote in the next election purely by knowing their race. That is a new and a very, very important and positive and exciting democratic maturity for South Africa. Then real transformation is the emergence of the black middle class, the emergence of black education. Virtually all black children are now literate by the same standards that literacy was measured in 1994 or 1980 or whatever. A huge progress in many fields. I can't go into them all now. Africa is rising. The world's highest growth region is now sub-Saharan, or what used to be called Black Africa. Around us, Africa is rising after having been the only region of the world that got poorer during the last generation of the last century. It is now the fastest growing region. That is what we need to join. We are stagnating while those around us are booming. We have robust institutions. Our courts, our media, this is a media briefing. Our civil society in South Africa is very strong, very robust, has challenged the government in the Constitutional Court and the High Court many, many times, and typically wins, and the government capitulates and honors those rulings almost always. Not maybe 100%, but we certainly have a lot to celebrate in South Africa. And then we have a constitution with lots of effective checks and balances. So what then would I recommend? Radical economic transformation options. Not more of what's failed, please. That is not transformative and it's not radical. So really radical economic transformation, and these are what I build up to, my conclusion is this is what it should include. Mandatory impact assessments, socio-economic impact assessments. It is a ruling of the Cabinet that all new policies and laws must be preceded by an impact assessment, but in fact that Cabinet ruling is more commonly overruled and ignored than it is upheld, and the Presidency has published rather good guidelines on how to do these, and these are ignored. For example, when we pointed out that there was no such document done for the ICT white paper, the nationalisation of Vodacom and Cell C and MTN and Telcom and so on, the effective nationalisation of them. The minister, before I was due to go and have a debate with one of them, quickly posted one on the internet and said, there you are, we've done one. Well, firstly, you just have to download it and look at it, and it's really nonsense. It doesn't follow the guidelines at all. It was clearly an afterthought, was not clearly done. So what you have to do is you have to actually say they are mandatory. Compulsory, they must be done by independent expert consultants, and they must be done to the satisfaction of an independent government agency, an autonomous agency that monitors and sees that they're done for all new proposals. And certainly we must systematically go through existing or extant proposals and delete and get rid of all these bureaucratic empires that have costs far exceeding benefits, as will be immediately apparent with something like the FSB and many others, the National Credit Regulator, the Consumer Regulator and others, that clearly will be found by any reasonable impact assessment to have costs exceeding benefits. So let's make impact assessments for past and existing measures compulsory and systematically work through all existing measures. State-owned enterprises. Now I want to suggest something really radical here. I want to show how radical I am. I want to suggest that when firstly they should all be privatized, because they are a failure and a disaster and a catastrophe as they are, all of them, all 200 or so, or virtually all 200. What we should do is not sell them, give them away. Literally give citizens shares, vouchers to get their shares in state-owned enterprises. It is radical, but it has been done. It was done in the Central European countries, the Czech Republic, Poland and others, where state-owned activities were simply given to the people for free. And this would be, nobody's done the calculation, nobody knows what it would be worth, but it would mean that every single citizen gets a few 100,000 rands worth of wealth handed over from the state to them. And then, this is the great benefit, instead of having to pay taxes to subsidize these failed enterprises forevermore, they will start getting dividends. So you in this room are paying for Eskom and for SABC and for SA Airways and so on. The staff are working in this politicized, oppressive system. You will start getting dividends. That's what will happen if they are just given away. You will not only get shares, but you will get dividends. And you will pay less tax, and you will no longer be required to subsidize these failed activities. And then the really radical proposal is, I propose that only black people get shares. Now, I know that that's going to get a lot of flack, but I think if you want a post-apartheid dividend and you want radical economic transformation and you want that radical economic transformation to be racially transformative, then you say, sorry whites, bad luck, black people are getting all the state-owned enterprises for free. Now, if it's too radical, and I understand I am too radical for many people, then we can have the moderate version, which is to give everyone shares. But I don't really particularly mind each way. There's a thing called the Coase Theorem in economics, which says it doesn't really matter who owns assets. As long as the assets are freely tradable, they will gravitate spontaneously into the most efficient hands. That's all. It doesn't really matter. You can give one person all the state-owned enterprises. As long as there's a complete free trade in the assets, those will be sold off to the most efficient user, which is what happens, for example, with farmland. You can give me a farm, I wouldn't know how to farm it. What I would do is sell it or let it to someone who does know. So that automatically economics will always transfer assets into the hands of efficient users. That's the so-called Coase Theorem, for which Ronald Coase got the Nobel Prize in economics. Then labour transformation. The Labour Relations Act has failed. You can't tweak it, you can't fix it, you can't mess around with it. It's a disaster. Scrap the thing. Get rid of it. Go back to the drawing board, start again with some new system of collective bargaining, and don't make it centralized. Let the people who bargain decide. Do they want it to be regional, local, at the firm level, just between the workers and the employers directly? So go the way the rest of the world goes, with labour relations that are more spontaneous, more diverse, reflect the will of the bargaining parties. and introduce JSECs, my colleague Eustace Davey at the back, job seekers exemption certificates. Whatever the labour law says, what you should say is that an unemployed person gets an exemption certificate from the labour law and entitles them to sell their labour to whoever they wish on whatever terms they wish, subject to minimum safety and other regulations, but you basically exempt the victims of labour law, that's the unemployed, from the labour law by giving them an exemption certificate after being unemployed for 6 months or whatever. Then finance transformation. Get rid of all these, the foreign exchange control, FICA, National Credit Act, FAYS. Scrap them. They are a failure. They produce no detectable, measurable, identifiable benefits. Exchange control is meant to sustain the value of the rand. Have you noticed how well it's done that? Surely nobody can seriously say it works. Surely nobody can with an honest, straight face say that financial advisory and intermediary services monster, the Financial Services Board, has produced benefits for anyone. Or FICA has resulted in a successful prosecution of anyone found to be doing money laundering or racketeering or drug smuggling or whatever. All it does is makes unsophisticated people incapable of entering into the financial sector. That's what these laws do. Sophisticated people know how to work their way through and around them. The majority of people are simply excluded from the financial sector by these laws, these measures. Then deregulate. Have a zero-based policy. Don't assume any existing regulation is legitimate simply because it's there. It has to be justified de novo. That would be a radical way to transform regulation. Work systematically through them. Do 10 a year or 20 a year or 5 a year or whatever, and just say that each one you're going to assume, if there were no regulation at all, what regulation would you in fact introduce? Let me give you a practical example. Window washers at intersections, we all hate them, or most people do. What would you, if there were no existing road traffic law that says they're not allowed, they're just simply banned, but they're still there, right? So the law fails. So what would you do if you're making a new law? Well, maybe you would say, let's have them. Some motorists want their windscreens washed, should have them washed, but make them in a way that we can all live with. For example, wear a bib with a number. This is window washer number 235. There's a phone number you can phone if they harass you or wash your window without your permission, and a price, 5 rand or whatever it is. Would that not be how you would deal with it in the future? Since clearly the police can't stop them, what then would you do? So I'm just using one simple example, but start with every regulation and say, is this the regulation we would introduce if we had no regulation with which to start, if there was zero at the beginning? So, and then special economic zones. We have in South Africa a law to create special economic zones. We have a special economic zones authority in the Department of Trade and Industry. But do you think we have any special economic zones? Well, we do. We have places called special economic zones. Are they special? No, they're not special. They have the same labour law, the same tax law. They're not offshore. They're not excluded from foreign exchange controls. In what way are they special? Well, they get government subsidies. What does that mean? It means you take the money from people who produce wealth and you give it to the people who don't produce wealth. That's not a way to make the country prosper. So what you do is you say they are genuinely like the Chinese or like the Indian or like Senegal or a genuinely or island or these special economic zones. It's completely offshore. It's not subject to the South African laws and regulations. It's out of the currency system. It's out of the tax system. It's out of the labor law system. All you have there is, like in the Chinese special economic zones, a legal system to enforce contracts and a system to protect safety of workers and so on. But there is no regulation. You move in and out of these Chinese special economic zones, which is where the Chinese growth has happened, incidentally. Freely. There's no visa controls, there's no capital controls. They don't even know what the balance of payments is. You don't even report it. You simply move money in and out as and when you feel fit. So that would be what we should create, genuine offshore zones in South Africa that are for practical purposes if they're out of our economy. Then devolution of power and direct democracy referenda. South Africa is a federation. People don't seem to know that. A federation means a constitution in which second and third tier governments have constitutionally derived autonomous or exclusive powers. That means we are a federation. But how many of you feel as if you live in a federation? We don't, because we have an assumption of uniformity. One size fits all. We don't accept that different provinces could have entirely different economic systems, different approaches, different labor laws, different education systems. We could, for example, privatize hospitals, have genuine health insurance where the state insures people who buy health from private suppliers, as opposed to what's now being proposed, one size fits all, which is not health insurance but health nationalization. It's health provision, not health insurance. And so what you would do is you would let each province do its own thing, policing systems and so on. That would be radical and be transformative. We could have a demonstration effect whereby we can see what works best. And then property rights. Have proper property rights. Now, since we have eroded any trust in South Africa's commitment to property rights, what I recommend is something the old Ciskei Homeland did very successfully. It did a deal with Lloyd's to provide investors with offshore investment against nationalization, or against, in that case, the introduction of taxation, because it became a tax haven. And nobody believed it. So what they did is they would pay the premium. So if you invested there, you were insured against the introduction of taxation. And by the way, when the new South Africa came, that was honored every year. The Ciskei tax system was upheld and ran its course to the end of a 10-year period during which the tax-free status was given. So the new post-apartheid regime honored that commitment of one of the former homelands, or Bantustans as some people would prefer to call them. So what we would do is guarantee property rights with international offshore insurance. That would be a way to get people to believe us if we say their property rights are secure in South Africa. So we could aim to be the top 10 of all of those indices I listed for you, get into the top 10 of every single one of them, like these countries and like these African countries, the latest amazing success story being Rwanda. And then finally, my last point is introduce the Kaya Lom system, or the My Home system, according to which apartheid land tenure, which persists to this day, most black South Africans still live under apartheid land tenure. People think that the 1930 Natives Land Act has been repealed. It has on paper, but it is actually still the reality of how black people live in South Africa. They do not have full, unambiguous freehold title with which they can do with their land as they wish. When they get so-called RDP title, they are subject to a preemptive clause, which says you may not trade your land or mortgage your land or let your land for 8 years. And in some cases, over 90% of the land has therefore been illegally sold in the black market in both senses of the word, or let, and black people live to this day under house arrest. In other words, if they are not found where the government put them, then the property is repossessed and they are evicted. Now, how is that for a new non-racial South Africa? So, what we suggest is, what you do is you give every black South African what white people have, where so-called white land, or predominantly white land, is owned or rented private land. Black people overwhelmingly, other than the ones who've moved into what we call the suburbs, the formerly predominantly white areas, black people occupy government land to this day. That was Verwoerd's fantasy and dream, and some of you have heard me say the ghost of Verwoerd walks around the Thule house with a big smile on his face saying, if I'd known the ANC would implement my racist land policies, I would have given them power long ago. And that is what we still have. We have something like 5 million properties that are owned by the government, occupied by black people, that can be turned, might be more, might be less, nobody knows. Our best guess is over 5 million. It's probably worth something like R1 trillion. That's about the size of an annual budget, or a third of the size of the GDP, roughly, just to give you some idea, so that you can inject into the South African economy this dead capital that people occupy but don't own. And not only do you enrich the occupants, by them now being owners, but you enrich the economy by injecting the equivalent of a full annual budget into the economy. That is how much wealth is tied up by the perpetuation of apartheid land policy. And not only does it give people this wealth, R1 trillion or more, but dignity, pride, security, equality, and real transformation. That is the way to get it. So our Kailam project, we've managed to bring the cost of converting a title to about 2,000 Rand, get somebody to become a homeowner on average around the country of something like, it's 400,000 or 500,000 in Longa, it's 50,000 in Babanongo or somewhere poorer places, but an average around the country of, for 2,000 Rand you get 100,000 Rand into somebody's hands and into the economy. That would be radical and transformative. Land reform, as it's now spoken about, Minister Nkwinti, took years, they said. It started off, if you recall, 10 years ago, saying 30% of the land should be transferred, redistributed from white to black people. I, being a land expert, kept saying 30% of which land? All land. Commercial land, industrial land, game reserves, parks, municipal land, residential land, urban land. We were never told. Eventually, Minister Nkwinti said, agricultural land. So then I said, okay, does that mean all agricultural land? Include government forestry? Does it include Sappi and Mondi? Does it include white farms, game farms, recreational areas? Eventually, he said, it actually means white commercial farms. In other words, a farmer with fields and cattle and plows and things. Doesn't include game reserves or, golf estates or whatever it might be. So now we're down to white commercial farms. Now, black people are meant to be excited about this. There are an estimated 30,000 white farmers. Nobody really knows how many. And their farms together are worth less than 100 billion. As I said, that's less than half the cost overrun on one power station. It's nothing. It's peanuts. It's meaningless. In fact, I must work out what the value of South Africa's annual peanut consumption is. It might be worth more than all the white commercial farms. It's a fraud. Whereas what you could be doing is having R1 trillion transferred into the hands of black people. That is real economic transformation. What black people are doing for themselves, buying land in the suburbs. Over half of all land transactions. That's economic transformation. That's land redistribution. That is what can be achieved. Now, a bit of touching the heart. I've had lots of facts and figures. Miriam Matupi, 100 years old, got her property in Ngwate, which is Pares, Tomahole, the Soweto of Ngwate township. And when she wept, a journalist asked her, implying, why does it matter to you when you're so old? You're going to die soon anyway. Why does it mean? Why are you attaching so much meaning to getting your title deed? And as she said through her tears, now I can die with dignity. I can leave something to my grandchildren, and I won't be evicted. After 50 years, my property is finally mine. That's what it means. She never said anything about its value. It's money. It's worth 100,000 or 500 or whatever the amount might have been. So that is the meaning to people. These are two people, a mother and a son, who got a title deed. On the day the title deeds were being handed out, they had some bricks and it started building. And this is what their house looked like 6 months after they got their title deed. That is what happens. The before and after. As one person put it, people used to go home with a bottle of brandy, now they go home with a tin of paint. That is what it means. That is transformative. That is radical. And this talk about redistributing 30 or 40% of white commercial farms is peanuts. And I'm going to work it out, actually. I wouldn't be surprised if poor people eat more peanuts than all the white commercial farms put together. So, our destiny towards getting radically out of the radical mess we're in, out of the radical poverty we're in, radical stagnation we're in, radical failure we're in, is not something that we have to regard as a matter of chance. It's a matter of choice. It's not something to be waited for, it's something to be achieved, as William Jennings Bryan said. Destiny is achieved. It doesn't happen. It doesn't roll in on the wheels of inevitability. And what I've tried to do is make some suggestions as to how to achieve it. And I thank you for your attention. And I hope that you and the viewers out there have at least got a view that radical economic transformation is a necessary and urgent imperative, that it must be radical, must be transformative, must be economic, and must produce inclusive growth, not just growth, but inclusive growth, and it can be done, it should be done, and the more that it's spoken about, the more optimistic I become that it might actually happen. Thank you for your attention.
Very comprehensive, Nick. It's the first time I've really heard real economic transformation, radical economic transformation articulated. So, any questions from the audience or points or lots? Yes, we'll start with the lady.
Okay. A couple of unrelated points. You haven't mentioned the corruption word.
Yeah.
It seems to me, and I'd be interested to hear your view on this, that if you look at what is the cause of so many of the problems that we're in, corruption has actually white-anted everything, education, the whole thing. It makes South Africa a very undesirable liquid investment target. And I'd be interested in your views on that. And the other totally unrelated thing is, my husband and I used to live in Central Europe soon after the war came down. And I would recommend that you look much deeper into that paper privatisation, because I don't think it was considered to be a huge success. The cashless privatisation leaves the company with no money, and also they, if for instance you wanted to privatise South African Airways, it would be much better to sell it to, for instance, Lufthansa, who would bring expertise, but then find a different way of getting the economic benefit to the poor. Because what happened with many companies in Eastern Europe was that they finished up bankrupt, rudderless, and as you said, people just sold their shares, and you finished up with rich oligarchs. But I'd be interested really in your comments on the corruption side.
Yes, corruption. I might shock you, but I think all the news and everything we hear about corruption is actually good news. And the reason for that is, I say to myself, do I want to live in a country in which corruption is covered up? Or do I want to live in a country where corruption is exposed and challenged and made a thing of? So clearly I don't want the corruption, and I'm going to get into a moment why there's a lot of it. But I certainly am proud to live in a country in which there is such a constant media vigilance, constant civil society vigilance, constant exposure, constant challenge to the corruption. That is something we should celebrate. That is a big, big silver lining on the corruption dark cloud. And I think it's very easy for us to recognize the dark cloud without the silver lining that attracts our attention to the cloud. And I think that is quite important. Then as to why there's a lot of corruption, assuming there is, the Corruption Perceptions Index puts us less than halfway into the worst cases. So we sort of average according to the index. But what I would say is we need to understand why there is corruption, and this is very important. Corruption arises primarily, large-scale corruption, where there's discretionary power. Petty corruption, paying a bribe to a traffic cop, police on the side of the road, that exists everywhere. And you obviously want to minimize it. But nonetheless, large-scale corruption, high-level white-collar corruption, that occurs because of discretionary power. So what you want to do, I mentioned there rule of law, and I mentioned over-regulation. If you have a regulation that says that you will get a mining license if you apply to the officials in the Department of Mines, and they will decide who gets a mining license, and this isn't done according to objective criteria, it's not done in a transparent way, it's done in a smoke-free room, it would be a very strange world where there's not corruption. If I say to you, you can decide who gets a taxi license, which is what we have. The law allows bureaucrats to issue taxi licenses. And I give her the right to issue taxi licenses. It would be a very strange world if she weren't rich. So if you give someone discretionary power, you must expect them to succumb to the temptation of corruption. And the way to stop it is have transparency and the rule of law and independent agencies and reduce. Let me give you an example. There is corruption regarding the issuing of taxi licenses. There is no corruption regarding who runs a furniture shop or a restaurant. Why not? Because there's no entry barrier. You don't have to ask for permission. If we had a system whereby you had to get a license to run a restaurant, we would expect A, corruption in restaurants, B, restaurant wars like taxi wars, people fighting against someone else who opens. If you have a taxi license and you don't, you say it's unfair. Why does she have one and I don't? And you're right, it is unfair to not allow everyone to run a taxi. You say, I have a license and he doesn't. Why aren't they stopping him? This is unfair. And you're right, it is unfair to say you've got a license and he doesn't. So you have a taxi war. You say you're going to enforce your rights against each other. So we need to understand corruption is a consequence of discretion. And the way to get rid of it is the rule of law, which minimizes or eliminates discretion. So there are two things then. One is the fact that we know so much about it is the silver lining. The way to get rid of the dark cloud in the middle is to get rid of the discretionary power. On the question of the state-owned enterprises, you are right, and what we need to do is learn from the Central European experience, but not ditch the concept. So, for example, we might dish out 50% of Eskom or SA Airways or whatever, and sell the other 50% on the stock exchange. Or, I don't particularly mind if people sell their shares. That doesn't bother me. I don't mind it. They've got the money, they've decided, they've made the choice, they need the money rather for education or housing or business, starting a small business or whatever. So I'm not a great one who's concerned about people who get an asset trading the asset. On the contrary, I think it's not really an asset unless you're free to trade it. So I would argue that's not a problem. But you're right, what they did end up with is with no clear management or controlling share interest, and so they went through a long period of myopia. Lack of capital, no proper leadership, no one properly in control. This happened with Volkswagen after the war, after Volkswagen was privatized, having been a state-owned enterprise under Hitler. So that experience we know, and we need to then decide how to do it. But I still want the principle, the concept. You give away, and give is the wrong word, you see. I don't think that you give the state-owned enterprises to the people. I think they own them. All you do is you say, we've lied to you, we've told you that what belongs to the state belongs to you. We are now going to stop telling that lie, and we are going to let you have what we've told you is yours. It is, in fact, yours. And so this lie that, the Freedom Charter says, for example, land shall belong to the people as a whole. That has been interpreted to mean the state should own the land. Mandela and Walter Sisulu and Govan Mbeki and the people who wrote it, Ben Turok, who actually wrote those words, have said that's never what it meant. Mandela said the people as a whole means the people, not the government. The people must own the land. And so, yes, we should say it is yours. You own the state-owned enterprises. They are yours. We've told you they're yours. Here is your share. Now, what you do with your share, in my view, should be your choice. But I do take your caution. Try to do it in a way that doesn't mean the company's undercapitalized, that doesn't mean the company isn't properly managed. And that, I think, is a discussion that has to take place, learning from that experience.
And 2 seconds, I would just add to your thinking the British model of privatisation of British Telecom, where it actually converted the mentality of the population, that people bought tiny numbers of shares, and then they became shareholders, and they became investors. And if we're trying to change people's thinking here, that's another thing to add into the mix.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I'm not in charge of who goes next. There were various hands.
This gentleman came up first. Yes. And then, yes.
Mr. Louw, I want to find out about this one. It's quite interesting. You said a chronological economic transformation is an admission that we have failed. All right. And now, since January, the ANC government has been piloting this phase of economic transformation, even the new finances piece. Correct?
Yes.
And every time when one was there, raising any people there or whatever, he said, I'm not going to come up with any change. No policy will going to be changed. Right? And by saying that, that's why Lucy Giga was saying, guys, listen, I'm here and I'm going to continue where my predecessors left by failing you. Fine. And now we've got another second part. We've got the market. Should be local, should be global. I say, hi, we've got a new guy there and we are not sure what he's going to do at Treasury. And if it's going to change, is it going to change policy or what? No, let us take our money somewhere else. Are these guys threatening us, knowing that now it's high time we need to do it the right way? Or Malaysia doesn't even know that these guys are threatening us. They want us to leave and continue with the policy that is in place, and that policy doesn't even work for us at all.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question, and I wish that he were here to answer it. I think it is right, you're absolutely right to observe the contradiction. Is more of the same, and you say that in the same speech that you say we're going to have radical economic transformation, and you say that in the same speech that you say we're going to have inclusive growth. Now make up your mind. If you're going to do things the way your predecessors did them, we will have radical economic stagnation. If you do the same way that your predecessors did it, you're going to have no growth, and that growth won't be inclusive. Well, it can't be inclusive if it's not growth. You can have inclusive poverty. And so you're absolutely right. That is why what I'm saying is, don't give up the idea of being radical. That is frightening foreign investors. They're worried about what does this mean? Does this mean nationalization? Does it mean that it's unsafe to invest? Does it mean that we're going to have crazy labor laws that make it unproductive to invest in South Africa? What we do need to say is it is going to be radical, it is going to be transformative, and this is what we're going to change. What he is doing, in my view, is achieving neither of the two. He's neither saying we're going to do things the way we did, nor we're going to transform. And I think that's a problem we face and he faces, and that is why we in the Free Market Foundation are saying don't give up on radical economic transformation. Stick to it. And this is how you can do it. And him trying desperately to keep the investment community on board by saying we won't change anything. The investment community doesn't want what we've got. You don't attract foreign investors by saying we won't change anything. What we've got is frightening them away.
Now, why they feel threatened if they think that the change is always coming? Why they feel threatened if they are not happy with what we got?
Well, if they think change is on the way, then they would be interested in what change will it be. Will the change be nationalization and a greater goal for government? Or will the change be reverting to the market economy we had after 1994? So the foreign investors are saying, we're not interested in the status quo. Forget that. We're not interested in if you want to out-left the left. If you want to go the radical socialist route, forget that. If what you're going to do is actually go back towards market policies, then count us in, then we're with you. That's what it, and by the way, I just want to make a very important point. A lot of people talk about foreign investors. What to me is more important is local investors. what will get local people to invest? And that does not mean white monopoly capital, that means local people. South Africans, all 50 million, to save and invest and have confidence in the future and improve their homes and improve their skills and contribute to local schools and so on. So we need to attract local investors. At the moment, local investors are leaving the country with their capital and themselves, which is why the government is thinking of how do we stop them leaving. It tries with exchange control, and now it wants to start with immigration control. What we have to say is our borders are open in both directions, and we are going to make sure that coming in is more attractive than going out, or staying here if you're already here with your capital. So any policy that is good for local investors will attract foreign investors. So I would like us to forget about foreign investors. So how do you get local investors to invest and stay? If you get that right, foreign investors will follow.
Is this gentleman next?
We looked at the peanuts a few years ago. It should be between 2.5 and 3 billion rand a year.
The peanuts?
Yeah.
Oh, in South Africa. Oh, okay.
Just to give you a sense.
Thank you. I always like people who are experts on peanuts. Thank you. Well, I'll factor that in.
So let's back and then.
Leon, you drew a very bleak picture when you set up the state of affairs in the country. What do you think? And of course, then you came up with excellent solutions, in my opinion. I buy into all of that. But what do you think are the chances, if you had rated on a scale of 0 to 100, that you will get any percentage of that implement, of what you're proposing? So, in other words, what I'm asking is, what is your prognosis for the rest of for the country for the next 10, 20, 30, 50 years?
Okay, if I'm forced to place bets, which is a hell of a bad time in South Africa to place bets now, but if you said to me, here's 100 Rand, place a bet on what you think is going to happen. I think what will happen is the alliance will formally break up, long overdue, it should have happened long ago, and it's clearly run its path, and as former President Motlanthe says, it doesn't really exist in any meaningful sense anymore. So I expect that is going to be formally acknowledged and wrapped up. Whether it will be before the next election, 2019, I don't know, but I think it's in the process now, and there must be discussions behind the scenes. SACP keeps talking about leaving. They wouldn't obviously leave by choice. I think what they're really saying is they're going to be kicked out, because at the moment they have everything. They are the only winners in the alliance by a very, very, very big margin. So when they start talking about leaving, it's a way of saving face at being told, go to hell, essentially, get out of here. COSATU is collapsing, and COSATU's only way of rebuilding itself is to become a proper trade union like the others and stop trying to be half one foot in government, one in civil society. And the ANC, to the extent there is such a thing at all as the ANC anymore, and that's really not clear. That's quite a statement to be making. I'm not sure there is such a thing as the ANC because of dual membership. COSATU and SACP actively set about openly, publicly promoting dual membership so that they could infiltrate and control the ANC from inside, and they've successfully done that. Can the ANC unpack that and go back to being a distinctive separate party? I expect it to try, and I personally hope it succeeds, but I would bet money on it that the traditional ANC is going to try and resurrect itself. So that would be how I would place my bet. It's not quite a prediction, but it's where I'd put my money. And then on whether they would implement any of the policies I've recommended, I would bet against that. I think what this gentleman asked about the minister is more likely, that they're going to try to perpetuate the policies we have and tweak them here and tweak them there and dial them up here, dial them down there. That won't work. I expect that to continue for maybe another decade of stagnation and going nowhere fast. And then at the end of that, there will really be no choice. And they will not be able to go the radical left solution. They will have to go the radical liberal solution. And I think that will happen, but I don't think it's going to happen soon. So I think we're going to have policies staying much as they are, and a lot of talk like nationalizing the grid or the telecom system, I expect not to happen. These crazy laws for example, regulating liquor, just to give you another practical example, which would have the effect of basically no new liquor licenses anywhere. Imagine black South Africans agreeing to that, to having the door closed for going into the liquor industry. That's not going to happen. So I expect these policies, these crazy policies, to be promoted and talked about, but not implemented. So I expect the status quo to continue, and then eventually, when it's just intolerable and been enough stagnation for long enough, that eventually they'll say, no, this is crazy. Let's go the route of Rwanda and Ghana and Mozambique and Tanzania and Mauritius, and free up the economy and become like all the others, prosperous. That's got to eventually be what they decide to do, and to me it's a question of when.
So the local investors are not going to stick around?
No, I expect local investors to continue to get their money out, to get their brains out, to get their skills out, to get their children out, and for that reason we'll continue stagnating until they finally throw in the towel and say, let's liberalize, and then they will all be ready to come back, they'll pour back in, because people actually love South Africa. You know, there's a statistic I don't know, and since you seem to know about peanuts, maybe you know about pupils. I go around the country and I see formerly white government schools. Linden and H.A. Jack and Roosevelt and so on and so forth. They are all now Houghton Primary School. I drive past on the way to the airport. It's 100% black. I don't see one single white student there. Now I want to know, firstly, where were those black students before? Were they simply not in school, or were they in township schools that are now empty? I don't know. But certainly all the formerly white government schools are now overwhelmingly or completely black schools. Where have the white children gone? Where are they? The people who were in those schools? Abroad? And what I hear when I ask the question, nobody tells me, maybe Mr. Peanuts can tell me, Paul over here, maybe they're in private schools. But I'm told, the statistic I've seen is that 70% of the pupils, of the learners in private schools are black. So they too have gone to some or large degree black, from being formerly virtually exclusively white. So I don't know. I just don't know. Now I suspect these are people who've left the country and gone abroad, who we need to somehow get back. And I suspect that it includes many people of colour. The white thing is, the racial thing is conspicuous because it's visible, but I don't think it's a correct demographic understanding of what's going on.
Sorry, I think if you want to get your number right, you need to include the peanuts and the beer together, but that's not my... Sorry.
Peanuts and beer.
Well, I think that's why you eat them, because it's salt.
Okay. So if they introduce the liquor restrictions, our peanut sales will fall. You need to get peanut farmers active here.
Anyway, that's not my point.
Okay.
Sorry. Just a contribution. So does this mean that RDP, the National Development Plan, is essentially dead? Because my understanding is it's a 7-year-old plan, but it didn't make provision for actual implementation. So, and now it's getting so old that people are saying it would even need a refresh. But I think that a lot of business is clinging on to it and seeing this as a impetus for the national development plan. It's like to say, we've been talking about it so much, let's do it. So I think a lot of people think that this radical
economic transformation
is actually the National Development Plan Mark II, you know,
Yeah.
as in.
Yeah, it could be that in the National Development Plan there are lots of things that most of what's in it has simply not happened. So you can download it, read it, open it randomly on a page and read, and you'll see it's all about the future 7 years back. Now, for example, it says that Eskom should be unbundled into a separate grid and a separate generating company, and there should be private generating companies. We should have an energy market. Should have happened by now. It's not happened. Nothing has been done about it. And that's probably the single biggest proposal in the whole thing. It's all in one page, but it would have the biggest economic impact of any of the ideas. So the answer is yes, no, it hasn't been implemented, and will it be implemented? I'm afraid to say that even if it is implemented, it wouldn't be radical or transformative. It is far too wishy-washy, far too moderate. It's tweaking. It's a little bit of change here, a little bit of difference there, a little bit of... So this business clings to the NDP simply because it's not radical socialist. So they kind of think, oh, well, we'll be left alone and we can carry on as we are. For business, the NDP says business as usual. But for South Africans, the NDP is not actually anything to be excited about. So I would say it should be ditched and replaced with radical economic transformation. In other words, reverting.
So I actually think it's quite important in the media for a distinction to be drawn between the two things, because otherwise I do believe that people will cling to an old idea, because people think it's the blueprint, and now we just need to give it a new name to, so I'm going to use the word, to sex it up, so that now
very, very
young,
little difference.
yeah, now the young people
What the
will be
NDP
interested in.
pleased business for was that it wasn't going to make things worse. That's really all business was excited about, is it was business as usual. But that is certainly not what the country needs. Sorry, the gentleman behind you I saw, and then back to you.
This might be the last one, though you have one more question.
About the schools.
Yeah.
I don't know whether we walk up to ask another couple of questions. Building on to the lady in front of this gentleman in front of you, one on the issue of handing out SME shares. You previously said that there's terrible economic illiteracy, and I just put it to you that surely what you're giving away is not an asset, it's a liability.
Oh yes, yes.
Yeah. Anyone who was stuck with a liability, that number one, they couldn't sell the shares.
Yeah.
And they're then going to ask to finance the liability either through capital raising from you now as a shareholder. The banks would say that they're unbankable. So essentially all those things would just fail.
Yes,
they would fail, and they would sort of immediately fail or fail within a year or so. And so that would add to your crisis, and I don't think that you would want to see that happen. So that's number one. Number two is talking about Gagaba and listening to what you said. Surely what you're inherently saying is that Manuel was a failure, Gordon was a failure, Gordon 1 and 2, Nanny was a failure. And I don't think that's correct in putting it at the finance department's door. It's the policies of governments and ministries which are then funded by the fiscus and the allocations from finance. The finance department and the ministry can do certain things that help, but it's really the government, the president and the cabinet's policies that cause the failures. And really what we've been saying as a thing is a succession of finance ministers who are putting their finger in the dam, so to speak, and trying to stop the wall from breaking. So nice to hear a comment on that as well.
Yes, I think I'm not an advocate of the so-called heroic theory of history, that history is about individuals. When I said there was the Mandela era and the Mbeki era, So and I think these people tend to be symptoms of the climate in which they operate and not necessarily the cause. They obviously are significant. You know, did Thatcher cause Thatcherism, or was Thatcher a consequence of what became called Thatcherism? In other words, was Britain going to go into that era anyway? And, you know, that's a different debate amongst historians as to what causes, what the determinants are of the cause of events. I would say that during the Manuel era and Gordon 1, what we did have was balanced budgets, and actually during Manuel reducing government spending as a proportion of GDP. Now, whether you credit Manuel with that or whether it was Mandela and the cabinet is an interesting debate. I don't have a particular strong view on it. I think it's a complex interaction of all the forces at work. But nonetheless, that era was one of moving in the right direction, and the economy started after 30 years of stagnation, growing at quite respectable rates, attracting foreign investment and functioning well. Gordon 1 was again similar. Nene was actually moving us back in that direction towards cutting the deficit, and he didn't reduce spending as a proportion of GDP, but he did reduce the deficit. So. And Gigaba is basically saying he wants to continue with that fiscal rectitude, and whether it's keeping the cabinet at bay, which wants to just spend and spend and spend, is maybe he's not up to the task or is not strong enough. You would have to have the cabinet's support. Now, for some reason, under Mandela and then to some extent Mbeki and Manuel, they did have that ability, and it happened. So whether we get back to that, and that's really what we have to hope. We have to hope that President Zuma and Gigaba mean what they say. We are going to have radical transformation. We are going to do things radically differently. And the radical difference has to be what worked in the past. That seems to me to, why not do what we've already done that worked? You see, that seems to me to be not a complicated thing to ask for. So I would actually say that I think we mustn't underestimate the degree to which we got things right. Bearing in mind that it was after Coase, after the end of the anti-apartheid struggle, when the ANC was taken completely by surprise. They didn't know that they were suddenly... I was at the Dakar conference. We were told there by people like Joe Slovo that he would not return to South Africa in his lifetime. And Mbeki did not, they expect to live the rest of their life in exile. They did not expect the struggle to end. I was told that by the leaders of the struggle. And one person, darn it, what's his name? He was the head of the ANC at the United Nations. His name will come back to me in a moment. He actually gave my wife and I the name for one of our books called Let the People Govern. And he said he would be back in South Africa in 4 years. He was the only one who didn't return because he died. So all of the others got here within 4 years, and the one who said they would be here in 4 years never made it, sadly enough. But nonetheless, suddenly, there we are. The Nats had no idea what they wanted in its place. FW said the greatest achievement in the negotiations was keeping Die Stem as the national anthem. I thought, if that's the best he could get, then he hasn't done a very good job. But they didn't know what they wanted. The ANC didn't know. We came into the new South Africa with everyone not knowing what the hell was happening, and the ANC did an extraordinarily good job in the first 10 years. Now, I think what they accomplished is easy to forget, but if we go back to those times, you have to acknowledge it was actually quite something. And a lot of credit has to go to Manuel, a lot of credit has to go to Mandela, and a lot of credit to others, like the Minister of Justice, Penwell Maduna, and others who are now long since forgotten. The Pard brothers and so on. So I would say I think we have a good track record, and there's no reason why we shouldn't resurrect it. There's every reason why we shouldn't continue with what we've got now.
Very last question.
The last one. When you refer to saying that local investors are living in their capital. You know, time and again, we told that the private sector is sitting on, you know, the last I think the last figure that I've got is about 700 billion. It started somewhere at 400 billion, and now I think it's 700. But I doubt it must have hit a trillion, I'm sure.
No, say a trillion.
Yeah. Are you referring to those people? Those are the people who are leaving because they can't spend this money here.
Well, they're not willing to.
The notion in the last 10 years was that here we've got the NDP when it was launched in 2012, and they invited these guys because they know that they've got cash. They've got enormous cash, and they want these guys to buy into this project which has been designed in the NDP. Now, I want to understand the story that because surely, I mean, one of the targets of the NDP, for example, is to reduce unemployment rate. And you look all these stats that are released by Status A, they are running parallel to what the NDP wants. And now, and it's difficult. When you ask this question to Khalidi Water, to you, say, can't we label NDP a flop now? They will target dive. Because surely it's a flop. You can't say, you can't expect 5 million jobs in the next space of 2 years.
Of course.
Whereas you failed to produce 5 million jobs in the last 3 years or 5 years.
Yes.
So I want to understand that the figure that you are talking about, that saying that now is sitting at epsilon, surely, into my understanding, it have been reduced if these people are leaving. If the figure was sitting at 700 billion, surely it have went back where it started, about 300 billion or something, because these people are leaving. It's not increasing on an annual basis because these people are not staying around in South Africa, they are going somewhere else. So one would be wrong if I say this figure now surely maybe it's 20 billion. It have drastically wiped off.
I have to confess, I'm not an econometrician and I'm not sure how those estimates or calculations are done. So I'm not qualified. I can't give an informed answer on whether those estimates are accurate or how much they mean. I think what is being said by the government yesterday, again and over again, is that these people, and bearing in mind they're not particularly patriotic, not patriotic, white, black, doesn't matter, all someone with capital wants to do is invest it profitably. So they're simply saying, if we invest it here, they're not willing to do it. It's too risky, and the anticipated rate of return is too low. Now, if they're trying to get their capital out, it's difficult to get capital out because of exchange control. So what they do is they get it out by illegal means, and there are people in this room that are doing it and have done it. And or they get it out by legal means by applying for permission to, for example, Sasol is building, investing billions in the USA at the moment. MTN in Nigeria and elsewhere. So they can lawfully get billions out. Old Mutual got billions out to invest in subprime derivatives and lost it all. So they can get capital out, and they do, legally and illegally. So how much is in fact left? I presume that's an available number from the Reserve Bank. I don't know. In other words, formal disclosed cash flows on capital account are presumably calculated in some reasonably accurate, reliable way. How much is getting out and pretending to be on current account, in other words, people pretending to import something, but in fact just that's a way of getting their capital out, I don't know how one makes that estimate. And whatever we do, what we have to do is say to those people, we are going to make it so sexy for you to stay here that you'll bring back what you've taken out. If they're taking out more, as you imply, than is disclosed, that's even more radical and more serious and more dramatic. And a rand doesn't have a race, a color, a patriotism that's kind of irrelevant. You want to keep rands here or get them back. It's in fact not rands, of course. Rands never leave South Africa. Dollars leave South Africa. You want to get them back. Yeah, I think that's probably
I think
it.
that's the last question, but Leon will be here for the next half an hour or so if anybody has another question, or if you want to, Bernard, if you want to. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Leon, for a very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. Our next presentation is on June 21st, where we'll be talking about the Free Market Foundation's alternative policies for the ANC to consider at their ANC policy conference, which starts at the end of June and runs for about 5 days into July. Between now and then, we're issuing a series of media releases, putting forward our alternative policies, so please look out for those in the press. And then we'll be having it culminating in a media briefing on the 21st, so I hope we'll see you all then. Apart from that, thank you very much. I'm sorry it's been cold in here. I don't know if anybody else found it very cold in here, but I certainly did. But thank you.